So I haven't done this talk ever. So I'm experimenting. I'm going to try a new talk. I do many talks, but this one is new. I'm trying it the first time. That's why I'm recording myself, so it works. Then I'll use it against someone else. If it doesn't, I will know what is the next one. And because I thought, well, you're all activists. You know so much about veganism and animal rights. So anything I'm going to say, you probably know a lot about it. So I should give a talk to you, since it's a special group that is unique and is something that probably you don't know that much. And what is the thing that I know about veganism that is not related to activism, things like that you wouldn't know? Well, I'm an ethologist. I don't know if you know this. I'm an ethologist. Ethology is the science that studies animal behavior. And it's part of zoology, which is the science that studies animals, which is part of biology, the science studies life, which is part of science. So I'm a scientist, which is a biologist, zoologist, ethologist, and I can actually give you my point of view of how veganism in animal rights looks from a scientific point of view, zoological point of view, biological point of view. And that will be quite unique because you probably don't know many of us. And that's what I thought I would do. But also because this event is title that is not about us. I didn't want to give you the classic talks that I normally give about my life, my legal case. You probably know about my legal case. I'm just going to give you very briefly the bit about me, and then the rest will be about somebody else. These two books, I got these two books. You can buy today if you want. Ethical Vegan I published in 2020 after I won my legal case that secured veganism as a protected philosophical belief in the UK. And this is a recent book of this year. You can get them with a huge discount if you get them from me today. And I can send them to you as well, so it's probably one. And so that's enough about it. You can have them afterwards. But this talk is going to be, I'm going to call it From Life to Vegans. And it's going to be a journey, quite intense and quite long, about how vegans came out from life, from how life came out. It's just a huge journey. And through that, we're going to be mentioning some concepts that we use all the time in our work and in animal rights. But sometimes people don't quite know what they mean, or they confuse them with something else, or they use them thinking that they are using them for veganism, and in fact they use them for other movements. And so through that process, and you can use the story, we'll be able to touch on these subjects, and I will give you the point of view of a zoologist, biologist, and biologist. Okay? Let's start. Everything started, 18.6 billion years ago when the Big Bang happened, and there was no life, because life depends on some particular molecules and particular atoms, such as carbon, nitrogen. That had existed for a long time. Even when there were stars initially, they only had hydrogen and helium. There were no materials for life for a long time. But every time a star was created, new atoms were created inside elements, and the star exploded, they spread them. At one point in the universe, there was carbon, there was nitrogen, there was everything like that. And about 4.6 billion years ago, in one galaxy we call the Milky Way, in one arm of the galaxy we call the Orion arm, a group of gas kind of solidifies into a star, we call the Sun, and a group that was not far away into a planet, we call the Earth. And it has all the elements necessary for life, carbon, nitrogen, everything. And it didn't take that long for life to appear. So the Earth was created 4.6 billion years ago. 4 billion years ago, there was already life. So just 600 million, immediately life appeared. In this planet, but appeared in other places. So that means life, once you have the right ingredients, that happens quite easily, but it needs to be the right ingredients. But for a long time, that life was just microscopic organisms today, like bacteria that we see today. Tiny microscopic organisms. If you would walk through the earth at that time, now you could travel in time, you would not see any of the life. Everything will be microscopic, beyond our capacity to see, because they were too small. And that lasted for most of the time. From these 4 billion that have been life on the planet, half of it, they only had these tiny microbes. So only about 2 billion years ago is when we start to see bigger things. Because that's when we had pluricellular organisms. That to the point we were just single cell, very small, very simple. Then the cells started to get together. And that generated one problem. The problem is when you're small, you can fit everywhere, you can move everywhere, everything is so close to you that you don't need organs or anything like that. When you get in big, then you can break up if you go in one direction. So there's a lot of problems that imply that having multicellular organisms, that was an issue. And the first thing that life did to solve is to create what we now know as growth. We are used to these concept things, grow. Well, nothing grew in the planet for a long time until multicellular organisms began to grow. And then we have the fungi that grows, the plants that grow. So they don't move, but they grow. So growing was the first thing that life did when it got to a big size. But at one point, you also needed to move somewhere, because growing, you start to wherever you started, and you might grow in all directions. There might not be food around. There might not be anything right. Moving will be quite convenient to be able to go to one place or another. And people think that the first creatures that moved were animals, but they were not. So moving, what we call translocation means you're in a place and the entire body can go to another place, that's called translocation, which you can move part of yourself in the same place. But translocation happened first with a slime. It's called the slime mold. It's a kind of very weird organism. You still can see them today. They are like amoebas. There's some group called amoebozoa. But they are pluricellular. Amoebas, they are tiny unicellular. They're big, so you can see them with the naked eyes. And they can translocate, they can gradually move. How do they decide where to go? Well, they have a very basic taste sense. That's the only thing they have. So they go around blindly, they don't see anything. If they touch something, they don't know what that is because they don't have the nervous system. They just leave some enzymes there. And if it digests it and it can drink it, then they drink it and the rest of the body then follows through. It goes around this. And if another part touches something, that's enzymes. So the first thing that was a sense was taste, a very basic thing. But other animals had already evolved, what we call the proto-animals, that they were not moving at all. The sponges. Sponges are the first proto-animals that they don't have organs, they don't have a nervous system, they don't have senses, they just have a hole, and things go through one place and that in another place, and they catch whatever goes through there. So they were already animals, but they didn't move. So the slime moved first. So translocation didn't happen in the animal kingdom first. But then at one point, the animals kind of find it very convenient to be able to move to another place rather than be stuck in the wrong place. But because they were already big, moving became a problem. And because they were not like the slimes, the right guys like amoebas, that they can just move in any direction, they don't have any shape or form. The animals, they had a shape or form, so they could not just project one bit and touch something. So they needed to perceive at a distance. They couldn't just touch something to know what's happening. They needed to figure out what was out there at a distance so they could make the decision, I go there or go somewhere else. So that's where senses start to appear. So first you could start to perceive light as a distance, vibration, that's the sound. Then the chemical thing of taste then becomes a smell. A smell is just taste at a distance. And when they had this ability to perceive the environment at a certain distance, that generated a problem. That there was too much information. Because if you only just touch here and find out whether that's edible, you don't need much processing. But if you hear all noises, you see all lights, you smell everything, that's too much. They needed a system to organize the information, and that's the nervous system. And why do they need a nervous system? Because they have to make a decision. Should I go there? Should I go here? Should I stay? So they needed also to have a way to decide where to go, and eventually they needed to move and go. If they decide to stay, decide to move. So these four things, having senses, having a nervous system, having an ability to make decisions because you decided that something is good or bad for you, and then moving accordingly to those decisions, this is what we call sentience. So when we actually all the time say, yeah, what's a sentient being? Well, a sentient being needs to have these four. But the most interesting thing, and probably you don't know this, is you could not have three of them. You needed to have all of that. It doesn't work that you can perceive everything, but you can't move and do nothing about it. You can perceive everything, but you cannot make a decision. So sentience is essentially having experiences that could be either positive, negative, or neutral. If it's positive, then the decision is, I'm going to eat, or I'm going to make with this. If it's negative, I'm going away. If it's neutral, I do nothing. So this ability to make that decisions cannot happen without the nervous system. And that cannot work without senses. So that means the first animals that appeared that had these, and that was about 750 million years ago, they were already sentient beings. And everybody has been a sentient being since. So the sponges that were before, they didn't have a nervous system. These are the ones we don't count. But we don't count them as proper animals, even if they are part of the animal kingdom. They are called porifera, pre-animals. So the metazoa, the proper animals, they're all sentient beings. Even the oysters, you might have heard many times people saying oysters and mussels, they are not sentient. Of course they are. They only go from sentient beings, and when you have sentience, you have an advantage over anybody else that hasn't got sentience. So if you have some mussels and that have sentience and others that don't, the ones that have sentience are the ones that will make the best decisions. Where to open the shelf, when to close it, when to reproduce, so they will survive. So sentience and being an animal is essentially the same. So that's why we can say that all animals are sentient beings, because actually the biology tells that having an experience require all these four things, they all have it. And if you look at an oyster, they do have a nervous system, they do have senses, they can move open and close the shells, and they have a ganglion, that is the bit that makes the decisions where to do things or not. So they do have experiences. So despite they have fewer neurons, they have experiences. So whether they have a nervous system that is central or a brain like ours, that's irrelevant. We keep hearing all the time people say, that cannot be sentient because it doesn't have a big enough brain, doesn't have... It's irrelevant. It's the information what counts. Where is the information stored is irrelevant. So it's like having a house and you want to know about the book and you buy books. Well, it doesn't matter if you have all the books in a library or you have them in different rooms, you have them by your bed. If you saw the information there, you use it. So we vertebrates, we use so much information that we put everything in the brain. But other small animals, they don't need to do that. And they can still perceive and make decisions. So you don't need a brain to be sentient. You don't need a central nervous system to be sentient. You just need a nervous system. And a nervous system makes no sense if you're not sentient. It makes no sense. So if they have a nervous system, you can conclude that they're sentient. Okay, that's the first thing that happens. So then animals become the sentient beings the first time, 750 million years ago. And for a long time, they started to consume each other. And something happened when you have two sentient beings, one that's trying to consume the other or trying to consume a plant. A new concept appears. And first, the concept of suffering and the concept of harm. And these are very important concepts in animal rights and veganism, and people confuse them all the time. So I'm going to give you the explanation what's the difference. Okay. Suffering is a negative experience. So when you're sentient being, you can have a negative experience. But when that negative experience lingers, that becomes suffering. So normally, if you're very small, something negative happens, you react, that's it, solution. You solve the problem. But the bigger you are, the more difficult it is to solve problems, because you have more information, more pieces of your body that cannot work, so might fail. And if you haven't solved it for a long time, that it becomes a problem in itself. So what it was just an alarm telling you something bad's happening, now the alarm itself becomes a problem. Imagine you have a house, you have a fire alarm. It's good that there is a fire alarm when there is a fire, but imagine that you stop the fire and the alarm keeps going, and then it becomes annoying. So that's what suffering is. Suffering is a normal mechanism, completely good. Suffering is good, it's essential. Without suffering, there is no pleasure. Without suffering, you would die immediately every time that something is wrong. You won't find food. Suffering is good, but it creates a negative experience to the individual. But in nature, that is tend to be minimized because otherwise it's a waste of energy and time. So in nature, there is suffering, but it's often minimized because their body had resolved the mechanisms to resolve this. But when you take the animal out of nature and you do something to that animal, put it in a zoo, in a farm, that environment is unnatural for them. The animal doesn't know how to process this information and to have the right response to solve the suffering. An animal in a zoo, so they never experience a zoo situation. So it might have in the genes that if you are in a place, you need to go somewhere else to find a hole and escape. So he's trying to do that for the entire life. That's what the body tells him or her to do, and yet there is no solution. So therefore, there's very few animals in the world that suffer more than zoo animals that spend their entire life, every single day, suffering and unable to resolve the problem. When another animal that is just killed immediately, they might suffer at that particular moment of time, but that's it. So suffering, if it gets too long, I call it the lingering suffering. That's the suffering that then you should be concerned about. But anything else that is natural and that it has a way to eliminate itself, we should not reduce that one. Because by reducing natural suffering, we put in at risk the individual that had that suffering for a purpose. And that purpose was to survive and to do good things. Where is harm coming to the equation? Well, when you have individuals that can suffer, if one causes suffering to the other, that's called harm. So for harm, you need two or more. For suffering, you might suffer by yourself. Something happened, you're depressed by yourself, you have indigestion, whatever. You might suffer individually without any connection with anybody else. With harm, is always the agent of harm, and the act of harm is called violence, and the victim of harm, which is the victim of violence. Violence and harm are really linked. It's a different way to look at it. So you can say, you harm me because you've been violent, or I'm feeling harm because you've been violent. So they're all connected, but they need to be an agent and then a victim. But it's a bit more than that. It's not just suffering. Because suffering is an experience, as I said. But harm goes beyond that. Harm can also produce something negative, but it's not an experience. I divide harm in two sides. One is that the experience harm, and the other is the negative fact, or negative experience or negative fact. What's a negative fact? Like die, kill, be killed. If you're dead, that's a negative thing for you. It's not an experience anymore. You don't feel anything because you're dead. But that's bad for you. If you cannot breathe with make you want to breathe, if you cannot have a home as you're designed to have, anything that is beyond experience, but that affects you negatively, that can also be caused by somebody else, and then is also harm. So harm might be causing to an animal, sentient being, a negative experience, or might be creating a negative fact to a living being. It doesn't need to be sentient anymore. If you kill a plant, you're harming the plant. The plant wanted to grow, the plant wanted to reproduce, you prevent that, that's a negative thing for the plant, even if it doesn't experience it at all, because it doesn't have a nervous system. So causing death is harm, as well as causing suffering and negative experience. So that's why it becomes a bit more complicated. And during a long time that life was on Earth, almost everyone that was a sentient being harmed somebody else. For a long time, you either ate the plant and killed the plant if you're a herbivore, and that's harm, or you either try to hunt a prey, and that through the hunting you're creating stress and then suffering and then death. So a lot of harming was happening. And you might say, well, that's life. And people that eat animals, they tend to say this, oh, harm is everywhere. But it didn't last forever. There was a time that there were some animals that they become harmless. And that happened about 120 million years ago. Up to that point, everybody was harmful. But at one point, somebody became harmless. Because the plants got a trick. The plants that moved to the ground, because initially they were in the water, they moved to the ground. Some of them developed fruits to reproduce, seeds to reproduce. And a seed, is just a little bit with the embryo and some little bit of food for the seed to grow, because obviously it doesn't have leaves yet, doesn't have the ability to get carbon dioxide and light, so it needs food to grow initially, and then they can get it from the light. And that's called an endosperm. And one point the plant, without thinking, created a bigger and bigger endosperm to the point that was unnecessary for the seed, but it was given to the animals that were about to kill the plant as food. So it was an interchange of, you eat that bit of endosperm, but you don't kill it. And some groups of animals decided that's a good deal, and they stopped killing plants. They were herbivores, but they stopped killing plants. And that's called the frugivores, because this thing that we have just described is called a fruit. A fruit is an embryo that has much more endosperm, and that endosperm purpose is to feed an animal, so that animal's not going to eat you, it's going to eat this. So the whole point now of the plant is not just defending itself or whatever. against an animal is actually calling the animal in with the night howls, true, saying, eat this, don't eat my legs, don't eat my stems and my roots, eat this. And by the way, when you eat it, move away, because you move, I can, and then spread my seeds. And that symbiosis of spreading seeds and eating a part of a fruit, that became very promising. In some organisms, initially reptiles, decided, I'm only going to eat this, I'm not going to eat anything else. And they were the first frugivores, 120 million years ago, were a type of dinosaur that was precursor of the birds that was already eating only fruit. Then the dinosaurs disappeared 60 million years ago, and the mammals and the birds that evolved from them diversified, and many became frugivores because the plants were already there producing all these fruits. And birds, many are frugivores. And there was a group of mammals who specialized, although they did cover many fruits, they specialized more in eating fruits because the way they live in the trees. We call these primates. About 90,000 years ago, 90 million years ago, primates appear. Initially they ate a little of everything, but the bigger the primate, the more they specialize in fruits, so they become frugivore. And you might think, well, what if you are enormous? You can't eat just for fruit. Apes, 50,000 years ago, the apes appeared, and they were frugivores. One of them became full evolved, the gorillas, but everybody else, the orangutans, the gorillas, the bonobos, the orangutans, the chimps, and the bonobos, they all remain being frugivores. So they belong to that harmless group of animals that could live happily without harming even plants. And one of them, 7 million years ago, was our lineage, the hominids. The hominids were split from the ancestors of chimps and bonobos, and we still were one of them. Still one frugivore animal, we call them the Australopithecus. So we started to move away from the trees into the savanna, but we still ate mostly plants. Still fruit that came from the trees, still new fruit, grains. Grain is a type of fruit, so they still eating fruit if they eating grains. So therefore they were special. They started to experiment a little bit with meat, carrion here and there, but mainly with frugivorous harmless. And then at one point, when some of them started to move further away from Africa where they evolved into the north and other places, they started eating meat. And there was this period of 1 million years that I call it the meat experiment, that the hominids, some species, started to incorporate more and more meat, especially because they were north in areas where there was fewer fruit, very arid areas. So they, as an emergency solution, they ate meat and they ate more meat, more. But all of those was extinct because they had a body designed for plants. So the experiment, I call it the experiment of meat eating that human ancestors had, failed completely. For many species evolved and many species got extinct. And the one that ate less meat of the all, these are the ones that become us. Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago. We were the least meat-eating hominids that existed at the time. And when we got together, the others died out and we didn't. So we had, our body was more in synchrony with the things that we're eating. And for a long time, when we were just spreading and everybody else was getting extinct, mostly we ate plants. So not just fruit, but mostly plants. Also a lot of roots, so they started to harm the plants. 10,000 years ago, then they developed agriculture. And people say, well, they domesticated animals. Animals was a tiny thing. Most of the agricultural revolution was plants. What are primates? Primates are frugivores. What are frugivores? Seed dispersers. We were seed dispersers. That's what we do even in the agriculture period. So we plant seeds and we disperse that seed from here to another place. So humans, ecologically speaking, our purpose is to spread seeds. It's not bigger than that. We are primates that spread seeds, and that's our purpose. And so we've been doing animal agriculture for a long time. So in the agriculture, general agriculture, there was a little bit of domestication of goats, but not much. And 5,000 years ago, that is nothing. It's so just now, 5,000 years ago, in the middle of Asia, there was a group of people, the Kargas, the first ones they called the Yamnaya people, that they were pastoralists. They started to use animals not just to eat, but to exploit. When they first started to use wool, they started to use milk. They actually could digest milk. Humans, we couldn't digest milk as adults. They could start to get. They started to have gods that lived in the sky. Before that, they didn't have. They started to have patriarchal societies. Before them, there were quite balances in the sex. They started to have horses for the first time. They had to have herds of cattle. They had to have wheels that they never had before. And because they live in the Pontic areas, in steppes, in what is now Ukraine and Russia, that's very arid terrain. So they could not stay in one place. They had to move the herd to the next place. So they had to fight with their neighbors. And they fought everyone, they expand everywhere, and they imposed their way of living. That is a hyper-masculine, carnist, meat-eating paradigm, which we still are today. So we live not in the world of humans, we live in the world of Kurgans, the Kurgans that spread. And that's why you have heard about the Indo-European language, which is the languages of Europe. They're all related. Even the languages of India are related to Europe. That means there was somebody that spoke a basic language that spread, the Kurgans. The Kurgans are the pre-Indo-European speakers. So they spread their language east and west, even to China, and they spread the idea of exploiting animals, not just for meat, that was done before, but now as a business of clothes, of cheese, or milk, and all this sort of thing. So, not that long ago, 5,000 years ago, but very soon when that happened, people that saw the Kurgans coming and with all these ideas and patriarchal God religious ideas, they reacted to it. Some of them, they reacted to it. And they started to challenge the Kurgan paradigm. And they were still a minority. And they started to try to go back to what they used to be. And they created a concept, a word. They call it ahimsa. Ahimsa is a Sanskrit word that means do no harm or non-violence, which is what we are, the primates, the non-harmed animals that evolved, the frugivores, the non-harming ones. They gave it a word, ahimsa, and they put it in all the religions they could. They're religions against the system. The Jains, they used it against the system. The Buddhists, they used it against the system. Which system? The system of the Vedas in India. Who brought the Vedas to the Indians? The Kurgans. So the Kurgans brought the sacrifices, brought all the meat. So there was the Buddhists and the Jains fighting against the Kurgans. In the East, the Taoists against the Confucians. Everywhere in Europe, the Pythagoreans, all these people that had different names, but they always trying to fight this hyper-masculine paradigm, meeting paradigm, and trying to return to the moments where we didn't need to harm, and actually do it themselves. So I'm not going to eat meat. Many were vegetarians, not vegan. But they started to change their behavior to prove that in nature you don't have to harm. And in 1847, just around the corner, some of these got together and said, well, we need to secularize this because we can just have it linked to different religions. It's too much. Let's create the vegetarian society. And they created the vegetarian society in England, but they half did it. They just didn't do it completely. They stopped the consumption of meat, but not of milk, not of egg. Some of them in 1944 said, no, we have to do it right. And they splintered from the group. And in 1944, they created the vegan society. They created the word vegan. They defined what veganism is. They created all the principles of the vegan philosophy. And if you read this book here, I will show you the 5 major principles of vegan philosophy. And the most important one, the number one, is the one I call the ahimsa principle, the do no harm principle. The doing no harm to whoever can be harmed is the minimum moral baseline. So they were the vegans. The vegans that they were created had existed forever with different names. We were the ones who were fighting the Kurgans and the ideologies that still exist all over the place. And we don't fight them because we against the system. We fight them because that's the natural way of being human. So humans in the ancestry, we always been leaning towards harming less and leaning towards avoiding being predators because of our primate ancestry, our ape ancestry, our monkey ancestry, our Homo ancestry, and our Homo sapiens ancestry. So, and that's the journey from the life to the vegan. Everything now should make sense to you. So thanks, man.